If you're interested in this series of courses, I'm sure you already agree that extractive companies should operate responsibly and sustainably within society. Let's assume that most people agree, in principle, that social responsibility and sustainability are important in the extractive industries. If most people agree on an idea, it can be called the norm. The idea that business decisions should be based on more than commercial or risk factors for the company has grown over the years. We're slowly reaching consensus that the benefits of this industry should be shared beyond the legal shareholders in each mining or petroleum venture. We mostly agree that the negative impacts of resource extraction on people and the environment should be minimized. But this has not always been the norm. The idea of socially responsible and sustainable mining, oil and gas production has only recently become a widely agreed upon global standard. In the past 20 years, there's been a concerted campaign by international organizations, governments, companies and NGOs to change our thinking about corporate responsibility and sustainable development. The debate at the center of this dialogue has been the question of who benefits. So how do we put this into practice? If professionals in these industries cannot apply this idea when they're taking everyday decisions, then the global standards will filter down into public relations brochures and get no further. The good news is that 20 years of talking about corporate responsibility and sustainable development around the world has produced many codes, guidelines, and toolkits for implementing these principles. The challenge now is to make this practical. There's so much information out there that it's really difficult to communicate it to busy professionals. A downturn in mineral commodity prices will make it increasingly difficult to draw attention to these issues, even as communities' unmet expectations and the shrinking of budgets lead to more risks of conflict. So this course will outline the most important actors in setting global standards for the extractive industries. It will then point out to you the most useful guides on how to apply the standards in different types and levels of operation. Finally, it will present two cases where global standards are being used to build social consensus around these extractive projects. Mining is one of the most ancient economic activities practiced all over the world. So what has changed in the 21st century? It's now a global economic activity. And what I mean by that is that although mineral rights are still vested mostly in the nation-state as the custodian of the people of a country, extractive industries are carried out by huge multinational enterprises. Shares are listed in New York, London, Shanghai, Toronto, Sao Paulo, Sydney and elsewhere with capital flows that are rapid and unpredictable. International organizations watch over these investments, and they have codes of corporate governance and responsible business behavior. Some of these actors include, of course, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the many agencies of the United Nations, such as the International Labour Organization and the Human Rights Council with its Forum on Business and Human Rights. And then regional organizations like the OECD, the Organization of American States, and the European Union. Industry associations have become important actors in setting global standards. The leaders here are the International Council on Mining and Metals and the Global Oil and Gas Association, IPICA. A most remarkable feature of globalization has been the rise of international NGOs. When an oil spill or a mining-related conflict happens in some of the most remote places on Earth, news of that incident travels quickly through these civil society networks and the socially connected media. There's literally nowhere to hide poor business practices. Advocacy groups like Publish What You Pay, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam and others have shaped global standards. For example, the principle of free, prior and informed consent of indigenous peoples. The Rio Earth Summit in 1992 was the first of several global conferences that brought all of these actors together to promote the idea of sustainable development. In broad terms, that means development without harming the environment to meet the needs of present and future generations. 10 years later, the mining industry was able to define an agenda in these terms at the World Summit on Sustainable Development. This was an outcome of the Global Mining Initiative, a series of consultations including on mining, minerals and sustainable development in South America. Out of this consensus came a series of guides led by the ICMM that have set the global standards. These guides have been updated regularly. Progress was evaluated at the Rio +20 summit in 2012. At the same time as the MMSD, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative was launched in 2002. Aimed at the oil, gas and mining industries, this global standard has had governments and corporations opening up their books to public scrutiny of taxes paid, revenues received, and any discrepancies in between. The IFC performance standards have set the benchmark for social and environmental standards in private sector investments. The IFC Guide to Stakeholder Engagement gives practical advice on how to apply these principles. The OECD guidelines for M&Es were updated in 2011 and offer sector-specific advice, including on mining due diligence in conflict-affected areas. The ILO conventions uphold workers' rights and protections in increasingly globalized supply chains. The Global Reporting Initiative assists companies to report accurately with templates and sample indicators of sustainability performance. In the area of human rights, the voluntary principles on security and human rights have been adopted by a growing number of countries and companies since 2000. They're especially important in conflict-prone areas, where oil production or mining heightens tensions between state security forces and rebels, separatists, or other militia, and sometimes private security providers. The UN appointed Professor John Ruggie of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government to clearly define the responsibilities of business in such situations, and in other cases where economic activities can compromise human rights. His framework proposes that it is government's responsibility to protect human rights, of course, but it's also equally the company's responsibility to respect human rights in every jurisdiction where they operate. And then it's a joint responsibility of business and government to remedy human rights violations when they occur in relation to these business activities. This course will explore what these international principles mean in practice in a range of situations and places. The first step for implementing these ideas on the ground is to make sure that all levels and divisions of the company, both the technical and the non-technical functions, really understand why they are important. This internal support is really vital to gathering the resources and the time that's needed to ensure sustainable and responsible operations. The guides and the toolkits published by the international actors that I've mentioned have step-by-step procedures for improving performance in key thematic areas. The best of these guides are aimed at the junior and medium-sized companies and not just the large multinationals that already have strong internal policies and procedures. Site-level managers and staff in the smaller companies may have fewer resources for community engagement, but they also have opportunities that the big companies don't to share benefits that larger companies do not have. For example, procurement of goods and services may be required in small enough quantities in a smaller operation that the local suppliers can compete successfully for contracts. In this era of globalization, it is easy to get online and access the global standards and find out how companies operate in other countries. It may be more difficult to translate these universal guidelines into advice that is directly applicable to your situation. This course gives you a map of where to find the best ideas about social responsibility and sustainable development from around the world. I hope it encourages mining, oil and gas professionals and their stakeholders to act on these ideas in their locality. Thank you.